Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games, and this week I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite dice-driven games. So these are games that are driven by dice, as the title suggests. They're not games that just have dice in them. There are a lot of Stonemaier games that actually have dice in them, like Tapestry, Scythe, The Rise of Fenris has dice, Wingspan has dice, but those games aren't driven by dice. We actually do have one game that is, and that is Euphoria. Euphoria is a dice-driven game from Stonemaier Games, but obviously it won't be on this list because my games are not eligible for this list. But I do want to show off the dice because they look pretty cool in this insert. So we went with custom dice, even though they are standard D6 dice in Euphoria. So I'm going to go into the top 10 list. Actually, I'll do honorable mentions and then top 10, and then I'll do some design discussion at the end about the value of dice, the types of things that I think about when I think about dice in games as a designer. So honorable mentions, that really fantastic games. Could have easily made this list, maybe if I had even played them more recently. Alien Frontiers, Ganz, Schon, Clever, Marco Polo, Celestia, Castles of Burgundy, and Coimbra. All fantastic dice-driven games. Let's jump right into the top 10. This one was a little bit of an outlier, but I really love it, and it's Kingsburg. Kingsburg is a dice placement game where dice are workers, kind of like in Euphoria, and you are claiming kind of the temporary favor of a series of different people that are numbered, I believe, 2 through 12, but I think they actually might go even higher than 12. In fact, I think it might even go up to 18. It's been a little while since I played this one. But as I was thinking about this list, I was like, I can't resist playing Kingsburg because it's such a simple, streamlined dice placement game. It's very easy to look at the board and see the value of the dice and the different things you can get from them. And it presents some really tough decisions in the game because you're deciding, okay, am I going to spend multiple dice on multiple worker placement spots, or am I going to pool all my dice together to get one of the really valuable spots but miss out on all those lower spots? And meanwhile, there's the tension of are other players going to take the spot that I want, because there's only one space for each number, each sum of dice on the board. I highly recommend trying it. It's one that might even be higher up on this list if I played it more recently. I played it mostly on the app, and it is a pretty solid app if you want to try the Kingsburg app right now in these times of self-isolation. So that's number 10, Kingsburg. My number 9 is Dice Throne. So one thing I love about dice games, are custom dice. And Dice Throne has these beautiful custom dice in the game. This is mostly a 2-player dueling game. And it has jumped around among my top favorite games because I really, really love this game. It's super streamlined. It's a ton of fun to play. And I've mentioned this many times, but I love the ultimate abilities. So in Dice Throne, one of the things you can do, it's a kind of a tight box, I'm not going to try to open it, but one of the things you can do in Dice Throne is try to roll essentially 5 sixes, but the sixes are represented by different icons. 5 sixes, and you get to use this ultimate ability that can't be prevented, it can't be blocked, it just makes you feel super powerful. But the odds of you getting it are pretty low. So I love that ability in Dice Throne, but just the idea of rolling dice and choosing one ability based on those dice. So you're not actually using, on many turns, all of your dice. You are choosing one ability based on the dice that you rolled. You can't break them up into different sections, which is an interesting design choice, that you have to roll until you can pick one action to use with those dice. I also really love the asymmetry in Dice Throne. Every character in the game has their own set of beautiful custom dice, and it is just a pleasure to own. It's a beautiful, beautiful game. That's Dice Throne, my number 9. Really, the only reason this is lower on the list is I mainly play this with Megan, my girlfriend, and it's a 2-player dueling game that relies somewhat on luck. And it feels really good if you are the one getting lucky in Dice Throne. But if you're not mitigating that luck well, it can be not as much fun. And so I am more conscious of that now that I'm in a relationship where a lot of my games are 2-player games. So it's dropped on the list for that reason a little bit, but it's still a game that I really, really love. That's Dice Throne, my number 9. My number 8 favorite dice-driven game is Deep Sea Adventure. This is one that I contemplated not making the list because it's is it really a dice-driven game? Maybe, maybe not. We could argue that in the comments if you want. But dice are at the heart of this game. It's a push your luck game involving dice, where you are sharing oxygen with other players, rolling dice to determine how far you move. It's essentially a roll and move game, but done really, really well, because the dice determine how far deep into the ocean you get and how well you can do to race back to the boat with all the things that you've gathered. And depending on how much stuff you've gathered. So you're gathering these treasures down below the surface of the ocean. Depending on how much you've gathered, you are weighting yourself down. And so even if you roll like a 5, if you have 2 treasures, you're only going to move 3 spaces. 5 minus 2 is 3. So there's that element of deciding how much treasure you want to pick up, how deep you want to go before you even pick up a single treasure, and all the while you're trying to pay attention to the other players because they are sharing oxygen with you. So if oxygen runs out while you're under the surface, you drop all your treasures. This is just a wonderful push your luck game. One of my favorite push your luck games, and I think it works really well because of the dice. And they are slightly custom dice. They are numbers 1 through 3 on the dice instead of 1 through 6, even though they are standard D6 dice, or not standard. They are D6 dice with numbers 1 through 3 on them. So that's Deep Sea Adventure, my number 8. My number 7 favorite dice-driven game is Sagrada, another one that could bounce around on this list easily. It's one of my favorite abstract games, and it is just so satisfying in this game to fill up your stained glass window with beautiful colored dice throughout the game. It's a game with a lot of dice. You'll be rolling a big handful of dice when it's your turn, and that's very, very satisfying. I love the feel of rolling a bunch of dice all at once, and Sagrada does that really, really well. And it's just a wonderful dice drafting game. I love the adjacency rules that you can't have colors for orthogonal adjacency. You can't have the same color or the same number next to each other. It creates this really nice puzzle. And I love that the little sheets that slide under your mat that give you restrictions. Some spaces are open, but some say, like this one says, you got to place a 2 there. You can only place a 2 right there on that slot. And the drafting element is great too. I love the snake draft. Snake draft is when I pick a die. Say I go first. I pick a die. We go around the table clockwise. Everyone drafting a die, and the last player gets to draft 2 dice, and the draft continues. So the first player to draft is both the first and the last player to draft a die. Sagrada is a wonderful dice game. It's my number 7 favorite dice-driven game right now. My number 6 favorite. You can see Walter in the background there. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but Walter is waiting for me to open his food. I'll get to him in a minute. Now my number 7, that was Sagrada, number 7. Number 6 favorite dice-driven game is Fantastic Factories. This game has really grown on me. At first, I thought it was solid, but I wasn't sure if I'd really return to it. But it is a wonderful little engine-building game, and the thing that I think elevates it so much and really makes it work is the simultaneous play. So basically, you are rolling dice on your turn, and everyone shares turns. They're simultaneous turns. So everyone rolls their dice, and then you decide how you want to use those dice. You're often placing them on cards to activate the abilities on those cards, or you have some standard actions on your player mat that you can use with the dice. There's a nice little thing here. So you're placing the dice on here to gain benefits, but for certain benefits, if you have pairs or specific numbers, then the benefits can be better. So it's nice that even built into the standard actions, the numbers on the dice have meaning. And then the engine that you build with the cards and how the cards relate to the dice is really, really satisfying in Fantastic Factories. I really, really like that. It's that simultaneous action selection that makes me really, really like the game, but the dice are a big part of that because you're rolling dice and then doing whatever you want with those dice, and then kind of looking around at other players to see how they're doing, how they're progressing in the game. Really, really fun, satisfying engine building game, and that is Fantastic Factories. That was my number 6. My number 5 favorite dice-driven game, and the last one that I own on this list, is Rajas of the Ganges. This game is a lot of things. It is a worker placement game. It's a tile placement game, but the dice are used in a way that I haven't really seen in many games at all. The dice aren't workers in this game, even though it is a worker placement game. You have workers. They're meeples. You're placing them on the board. The dice are your resources, and kind of abstract resources at that, but that's okay. The dice, I don't know, it's just so much fun. The board lets you place workers and then you spend the resources that are the dice on the board. There are spaces where they want certain numbers of dice. There are spaces that want certain colors or certain combinations of colors. And the tiles that you're gaining throughout the game, they require certain numbers and certain colors of dice. And you're placing those tiles to get more dice and more other things. It is a really satisfying Euro game. I highly recommend this if you like medium weight Euro games. There are other mechanisms that I'm not even talking about here that are really awesome that just aren't as related to the dice. But I love the use of the dice as resources in this game, not as workers or as other things. Really, really great game. Rogers of the Ganges, my number 5 favorite dice-driven game. Now let's get to the top 4. These are games that I don't own, but I still very much love them. Number 4 is Space Base. Space Base is a game where one player is rolling some dice and all players are potentially benefiting from those dice. And it's kind of like the next evolution of Machi Koro, if you've played Machi Koro. It's Space Base is you're using these dice to activate specific numbers. So if another player rolls a 12, I have an ability built into the game from turn 1, which I think is the reason that Space Base is really elevated over other similar games. I have a 12 value ability right from the start. And that ability only gets better through choices that I make, through the cards that I buy throughout the game to upgrade that specific number. I also really like in Space Base that you can choose to add the dice together or split the dice. So this actually makes, unlike many of these games that are in this style, 7 is the sweet spot, right? Because 7 you're going to roll a little bit more than the other numbers usually. In Space Base, it's really numbers 1 through 6 and 7 and 8 that are really valuable because you can split the dice. If I roll a 1 and a 6, that could be a 7 or it can be a 1 and a 6. And throughout the game, I can upgrade the abilities for 1 and 6 to make them really, really strong. Or I can upgrade the abilities for 3. 3 is just as good as 1 or 2. And splitting them also allows the dice at the full range. You can include 1 in that, whereas if you're always adding the dice together, you can't include the number 1 in it. But I just love the ability to upgrade these actions and make certain dice rolls better in Space Base. It's really easy to get to the table. I guess it's a little bit of a hassle to set up because you got to put out all the cards, but it's not that bad. And I just have a blast with Space Base. I'm always happy to play it if someone wants to get it to the table. That's my number 3, Space Base. My number 4 favorite dice-driven game. No, that was 4. My number 3 favorite dice-driven game is Dice Forge. This is the only game on this list and one of the very few games of this style where you are actually building the dice. The dice are these big plastic dice. They started as dice, and you actually pick pieces off the dice and put new plastic pieces onto the dice throughout the game. So your dice are getting better and better. It's kind of a deck building game, really, except the deck is the die itself that you're building. One thing that I think Dice Forge does really well is that it has you roll your dice on every turn. And this, I think, is crucial in a dice game. Not that you necessarily roll your dice every turn, but that you do roll your dice and that you roll your dice a lot. That's what's fun about dice games, that you're rolling dice a lot. And that you yourself are actually handling those dice and rolling them. And I always confuse Dice Throne and Dice Forge. This is Dice Forge. Dice Forge does that really, really well because every turn, on every player's turn, every player is rolling their own dice and gaining the benefits from them. It's only on your turn that you're actually buying stuff in Dice Forge. I think that's a good control. You don't want multiple players trying to buy stuff at the same time. But yeah, I love that aspect of rolling your dice every turn. It makes the game really kind of fly by, and you're always engaged in the action in Dice Forge. That's why it's my number 3. Really, maybe the only reason that it is knocked back a little bit is that getting those little plastic pieces off your dice is a huge pain. You can use other pieces to kind of pry them out, but then they pop out and they go everywhere. And if you don't do that, if you're a little more careful, then you end up stabbing your finger over and over again. So it's a weird game in that I associate this game a little bit with physical pain, which is not a great association for the game. It's too bad because otherwise the game is fantastic, and I'm still always glad to play it. I just know I'm going to be in for a little bit of a pain afterward or during. That's Dice Forge. My number 2 favorite dice-driven game is Sushi Roll. I love Sushi Roll. And even as I put this on this list, I was like, oh, I gotta play the Sushi Roll. It's been too long since I played. It's been a few months now. But Sushi Roll is a dice drafting game with beautiful custom dice. You can see them in the image, probably on the screen right now, in the main image that I used for this video. But there's these big, beautiful custom dice that you are passing around the table. And the thing that I love about Sushi Roll, again, I mentioned that the great thing about dice-driven games that I really love is that you roll the dice a lot. And with Sushi Roll, on every turn, you roll the dice that are passed around to you. So it's not like all the dice are rolled at the beginning of the round and they're passed around the table on these little cardboard tiles. They are passed around the table, but as you receive it, you roll all those dice. So you have information coming around the table. You can see, okay, I'm gonna get 3 green dice in a second. I know that might mean that I can do that. I might roll this. The odds are greater that I'll roll X, Y, or Z. But you don't really know until you actually get the dice. So you have this interesting level of information. You have some information, but not all information, and you still get that satisfying aspect every turn of rolling some big, beautiful dice. I love that about Sushi Roll. Yeah, and I highly recommend it. It's just a fantastic game. But my number one favorite dice rolling game is Roll Player. Both of the top 2 games have roll in the name. Several other games on this list have dice in the name. But Roll Player, I love Roll Player. It actually violates a few of the things that I mentioned on this list because in a Roll Player, you aren't actually rolling all your dice every turn at all. Only one player is rolling the dice, and you're drafting those dice throughout the round. But basically, the idea in Roll Player is that you are placing dice on your player mat to build your character, a D&D style character, and everything else from there is kind of abstracted. You are trying to meet certain conditions for how the dice line up. The dice have different abilities based on the skill that you associate them with. You're worrying about your character's alignment. There's all these puzzly aspects that go into like the color of dice that you draft, the numbers in certain rows that are associated with your skills. But it is a wonderful puzzle that emerges from this game. And one thing that I want to highlight, that I often highlight about this game, is that I love that you start out with some really fun decisions right at the beginning of the game. You actually build part of your character before the game even really starts, where you draw a number of random dice, you roll them, and then you place them on your board as you wish. So right from the start, you feel powerful because you are setting yourself up to do things right from the beginning, but you're also restricting yourself because you're deciding that there are certain bonuses that you're not going to get all that much in the game because of where you place those dice early on during setup, really. But I love that choice right from the start. It's probably a little intimidating for a new player, but for someone who's played Roll Player a number of times, I think it's a wonderful choice at the beginning of the game. Fantastic game. Roll Player, that's my number one. I'd love to hear, before I go into the design discussion, I'd love to hear in the comments below what your favorite dice-driven games are, and what you think about the games that I mentioned on this list, what your favorite aspects are about them, what you think, if you think the dice actually elevate these games or if they don't. And that's one element I want to mention the dice in the design discussion here, which is that rolling dice is really satisfying. I really love that feeling of rolling dice. And I love it, as I mentioned, that in these games where you are allowed to roll the dice a bunch of times. But at the same time, dice do add a fair amount of luck and randomness to games. It depends on how they're used, but there are cases where you might be thinking about using dice in your game where cards might actually be more effective. I've heard this used in Settlers of Catan, where in Settlers you are rolling dice, but there's also a deck of cards that you can use in Settlers instead that has an even distribution. And so you can, the cards are essentially dice, but dice that are pre-rolled into an even distribution of dice. And so you just flip a card and you reveal it, and that is the number for that turn. And the key here, I think, is that you don't get hit with situations where statistics don't kind of follow their own rules, and you end up rolling a bunch of 12s one game. And it's weird and exciting, maybe memorable, which is the great thing about dice, but can also be really, really frustrating for someone who has ignored that number. And so with the deck of cards used for dice instead, you know that at some point in the game that 12 is going to come up for sure, 100%. And you also know that it's not going to happen often. It's going to happen once. So I think that's kind of nice to have in Settlers of Catan. And it could apply to other games too, where that even distribution, or that, I guess, correct distribution of dice actually happens in the game instead of it happening randomly. You also have information there. You know for sure certain numbers are going to come up at certain times at some point in the game instead of never being rolled. I'm sure you've all had a game of Catan where a certain number that you were betting on just was never rolled. I love custom dice. I mentioned that a few times. I really, really love custom dice. I love the way they look. I think they provide a nice hook to the game. They're one of those must-have components in games. And I think there are two ways that you can do it. One way is just if you need standard D6 dice in your game, I think it is better to make them custom D6, as we did in Euphoria, as we did in Side, The Rise of Fenris, to make them custom D6 dice instead of standard dice with pips on them. Yes, you have to pay for a mold to get them made, or in Wingspan's case, they're wooden dice, so you have to create them a different way. There are upfront costs to that, but I think it's worth it. I think it's worth creating your own special dice for the game. I think it's worth it in terms of marketability, and I think it's worth it in terms of thematic immersion in the game itself. As long as the dice are very clear and easy to read, which you've probably encountered games where a game designer or publisher attempts this, and the dice just aren't as clear as they should be. At the same time, I really also love beautiful, truly custom dice that go beyond just the 1 through 6 numbering. That just to me is a huge component hook. I love that. The one challenge there, though, is playtesting. And you kind of have a choice with playtesting there. Do you have people sticker dice and draw the icons on the stickers, or somehow print on the stickers and put those on the dice? Or do you just assign values to numbers 1 through 6 on the dice and just have playtesters have a little cheat sheet that says, okay, 1 equals this weird icon, 2 equals this other weird icon? We've done it that way. We've tried games with that, some games that you haven't seen yet, and it works. It works pretty well to do it. It's not ideal, but it works decently well. But I think it's worth it to pursue custom dice when you have the opportunity to do so. The other thing to consider is, even though D6 are kind of the standard dice, my favorite die to roll is the D12, as you can see in Tapestry. Tapestry's research die is the D12. I just love the feel of a D12 rolling across the table. It just rolls so smoothly and so organically out of your hand. It's just personal preference, but I love it. I think that's one design consideration to think about. Even though D6s are standard, they're probably the easiest to play test with and the easiest to create. There are other dice shapes out there. So if you have a favorite die that you really love to roll, you can make it. It is possible to make it. Especially in Tapestry, it was kind of key to have an even distribution of 4 different tracks on the die. And so we could have gone with a triangular, like a pyramid-shaped D4, but I don't like the way those roll. That just doesn't have a satisfying roll to me. I think a D12 is way more satisfying to roll than a D4. What else? Talked about playtesting. Last, I'll just say it again. I think dice are meant to be rolled in games. Yes, there are other uses for them. They can be used to track information fairly well. I think there are maybe better ways to do it. Like if you're just tracking numbers, dice can almost be a little fiddly because you got to turn around to find the right face of the die to put it on. And while you're doing that, while you're handling the die, for me, I always find myself thinking in games like this that use dice to track information instead of as dice to be rolled. Honestly, Role Player doesn't do this. Like, you don't roll the dice all that much in Role Player. I just happen to really love Role Player as a game, and the way dice are used in it. But as I'm handling dice in those situations, I find myself wanting to just roll them, because that's the great thing about dice, that you have that satisfaction of rolling them. I've heard this even from digital game designers, that people, it's one of those tactile things where it's just not as satisfying to roll dice in a digital game as it is in person with real dice. So if you're making a dice game, and this is something I discovered while designing Euphoria, which I originally used dice to track information instead of actually rolling them, but people want to roll the dice. Look around the table at your playtesters. If you have a game where you're using dice to track information and not roll them, look around the table and see how playtesters are responding to that versus the moments where they actually get to roll the dice. There's a huge difference there. So just something to keep in mind. I don't think that's a global, universal statement. I'm sure there are cases where it's better just to use dice to track information. Role Player is an example of that. But I think if you are putting dice in your game, let players roll them. They want to roll them. They really do. Those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts about game design in regards to dice as well, and your favorite games that use dice. And I really look forward to the conversation we're going to have in the comments about this. Thanks.